This is Recovery Radio Fresno with your host, Louis Angel. Today we got a very special guest calling all the way from Southern California, Deborah Galasso. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Louis. Thanks.
Excellent. Now Deborah wrote an amazing book about the Serenity Prayer. She's also going to talk about her life in recovery and also about her website and a number of different things that pertain to recovery. So without further ado, Deborah, it's all you.
Thanks, Louis. Well, as you said, my name is Deborah, and I am recovering from marijuana addiction and codependency. And whenever I tell my story, I always like to say that my life started out pretty much like everyone else's. In the beginning, I was happy and secure, and I had all my needs met. And then I was born into this sinful world, and that's when all the trouble started. And when I think back on my life for as long as I can remember, I was a very fearful person. And I think part of that had to do with the fact that I grew up in a family where my father had a very explosive temper. Now, I never saw my father drink. He didn't use alcohol at all, but he was, what I would call a rageaholic. And his temper was very unpredictable, and everyone in our family was afraid of him, including my mother, and so we all tried to walk on eggshells and tried to be as good as we could and make as little noise as possible, and my mother was in the background orchestrating all of that, and I think that's when I first, learned to be afraid. About the time I was 5 years old, there was a traumatic thing that happened in our family that affected me, that kind of caused me to have some abandonment issues, and that is that both of my parents contracted tuberculosis. And back in the 1950s, the treatment for tuberculosis was very different than it is now, and they both had to be hospitalized for a very extended period of time. My mother was gone for 6 months, and my father was gone for just about a year. And during that time, I went to live with family members, which was fine. They loved me, and I was taken care of. But, in the life of a 5-year-old, losing both your parents like that is very traumatic. You really don't understand the idea that it's temporary, and you're worried. And I think that just kind of augmented the fear problem that I had. My family, my parents took me to church when I was a kid, so I did grow up knowing about God and believing in God. But the church we went to was kind of what I would call a kind of a legalistic church. It had a lot of rules and regulations about, how people should act. And, when I think back on it, I kind of refer to it as the first church of shame and guilt because, there were just so many rules to follow. And but I did have that foundation, and I'm very thankful for that. When I got to be college age, I kind of knew that I was going to have to go to college whether I wanted to or not because my father had not graduated from college, and that was his dream that his kids would. And so being the firstborn child, that mantle kind of fell on me. So off to college I went, and I went to nursing school at a Christian university, and the thing about it is that the university setting was just even more legalistic than my church had been, and I didn't know anyone, and once I got into the nursing program, I didn't like nursing, and the change, moving away from home and everything was just caused my anxiety to go crazy, and I really thought during that time I was going to have a nervous breakdown. I was just so fearful and nervous, and just about that time, I met a guy who introduced me to marijuana. And when I was introduced to marijuana, it was just like the fit was there. I mean, it just changed me. I had finally found something that calmed me down, and I could feel better about myself, and I could become more outgoing. And I was like everybody else. I just used it recreationally, and the thing about an addict is nobody sets out to be an addict. I mean, we all start out the same way. We're just kind of using recreationally, and then we see that, it does something for us. It medicates, some issue in our life, and then we keep repeating it. So that's kind of how I got introduced to marijuana, and that remained an issue for decades. And in my early 20s, I got married because part of that was, I fell in love, but part of it, too, was that I really thought that love was going to be the solution to my anxiety problems. If I just met the right person and got married, I would feel more secure and better able to cope with life. And so then after I got married and that didn't happen, what really happened was he came into the marriage with a lot of issues. I already had all these, fear issues. And so we had a lot of conflict, and I just remember that, as the conflict grew in our marriage, it got into a situation where, we just kept blaming each other for the problems. We were both pretty immature, and I remember at one point in our marriage, we went to see a marriage counselor, and the counselor said to us, well, there's really only two options for your marriage. You're either going to work on it and it's going to get better, or you're not, and you're going to end up getting a divorce. And I distinctly remember thinking, as I sat in that office, no, there's a third option. I will just use more marijuana so that I can, medicate my feelings and stay in this marriage until my children turn 18, and then I'll get out. And so that is really pretty much what I did from that point on. And, the thing about an addiction is that it's chronic and it's progressive. It doesn't stand still. And, over time, you begin to develop a tolerance, even to marijuana. I mean, people think marijuana is not addictive, and that's not my take on it at all. And so, as you develop a tolerance to a substance, you have to either use more frequently or increase the quantity, and that's what I did. I started smoking more often, and pretty soon it got to be I was smoking on a daily basis, and then I was smoking as often as I could. And I would go out into my garage. We had a detached garage in the home we lived in, and I would go out to the garage, and that's where I would smoke because I didn't want my children to know. Of course, my children probably did know this whole time, but I thought I was covering it all up. And essentially, my life was just reduced to living in my garage. I mean, I would go to work and I would do whatever I had to do, but in my free time, I was, essentially living in my garage, and my life centered on that garage and the use of marijuana. And as this began to happen, I hated my life. I hated the fact that I was lying to everyone and covering up and keeping this secret from everyone. And most of all, I hated being alienated from God. Because every morning, every day it would be the same thing. At night, I would go to bed at night promising God I was going to quit. I was going to change my life. I was going to do better. And every morning I would get up and I would head out to the garage, and I would just start, this downward cycle all over again. However, God is so good, and God found me in the middle of all of this. And what happened was we had a new manager on the. I was working on a mental health unit at the time. I was a nurse, and we had a new manager, and she insisted that everyone should learn about chemical dependency because she had a chemical dependency background. So I was going to all these classes on chemical dependency. And the longer I went to these classes, the more I couldn't deny that I had a problem. And, step one says that we admitted we were powerless. And so that's what I did. I didn't know I was working step one at the time, but I admitted to a coworker that I had a problem. And that coworker told me about a chemical dependency counselor, and I made an appointment with her. And when I went to see her, her first words, when she listened to me, her first words were, you're addicted to marijuana, and until you stop using, your life can't improve. And so that's the first thing that has to happen. And so she insisted that I go to 7 meetings in 7 days. And, it had been years since I had not used marijuana. I had never gone 7 days in years and years without using. so I did go to the 7 meetings in 7 days. I was able to be abstinent for that time. And then that was the beginning of my recovery at the end of those 7 days. And I had a few relapses along the way because I just couldn't, I just couldn't understand that idea of powerlessness, I didn't get what they call the pickle theory of chemical dependency, which is once a cucumber becomes a pickle, they can't change back. And see, I kept wanting to change back. I kept wanting, to be a cucumber again. I kept thinking, well, after I get some recovery under my belt, I can use recreationally again. And so I had to relapse a few times before I came to the point where I realized, I am truly powerless over marijuana, and there's no such thing as one for me. And I have to, it's a disease that I have to manage every single day of my life. And so, it's been over 13 years now. 13 years ago, I became involved in the recovery ministry at my church. And, actually what happened is my minister kind of preached this series that sounded a lot like the 12 Steps. And I went to him and I said, that was really a good sermon series. And we should have a group, a 12-step group for people that are struggling with addictions. And so that's kind of how it started, after a while, after we had been meeting just as a 12-step group for a while, we received a flyer on inviting us to the Celebrate Recovery Summit. And so once we went to that, then we switched over and became a Celebrate Recovery group. And, one of the reasons why I serve in the recovery ministry at my church is because I want to make sure that there is always a safe place within the church to recover. And, that's not true when I was struggling with my addiction, because for part of the time when I was struggling with my addiction, I was going to church, not the church I'm at now, but I was going to church, and there were no groups for someone with my problem, some of the attitudes that I heard expressed in church toward people with drug and alcohol problems were just very judgmental. And, in fact, there was no way I was going to tell anyone what was going on with me because of those attitudes. And so, right now my life is pretty much about, making sure that there's a safe place for people to recover, to do what the book of James says, which is confess our shortcomings.